I'm looking forward to that all around. Fantastic. Well, good. Well, Jordan, anything that you need before we kind of begin here in just a second? Are you good to go on your side?
I think I'm good to go on my side.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Well, that is the only real announcement that I wanted to share. Otherwise, guys, is just remember, right? Tomorrow, that's going to be so much fun. 1:30 to hopefully beam in or physically be there to cheer Jamie on and celebrate this wonderful dedication of Lynn's statue in the Ostrom Commons. I saw yesterday that it's there just under a tarp, so that's good to see. And then other upcoming events, we do have the last of our colloquia series and the research series, both next week. So I believe, Renzo, you're up next week, right? In the research series with Is Governance Enough? Right, that's going to be awesome. And then our last colloquium speaker as well is next Monday. Still lots of events, though, with the Tocqueville series. You've been hopefully keeping active with that as well. And other stuff. There's always stuff, right? But those are the last two on our main calendar here. Cool. So without further ado, then I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you, Jordan. So, oh, good. I'm glad to hear that, Jamie. Awesome. And Aurelian does a fantastic job of curating that. So without further ado, let's get you teed up. So Jordan Lynton, as you guys all know, is a doctoral student in anthropology and an Ostrom fellow, working with Edu. Thanks for joining, Edu, and Bill Blumquist, our very own. Both counts there. And today she'll be speaking on her work, Deconstructing Global Rhetorics of Mutuality and Progress Surrounding Chinese Development in Jamaica, which was, I thought, absolutely fascinating. It's a subject I basically knew nothing about. So thank you so much, Jordan. I really, really appreciate it. And over to you.
Okay, thank you guys so much for being here today. So my talk is going to be based loosely off of not loosely, off of a current chapter that I'm working on, the 5th chapter of my dissertation. And so I just wanted to, before I started, to just make it clear that this is a work in progress, and that any kind of thoughts or reflections that you might have would be deeply appreciated. Also to say that I share an office space and my office mate is currently on a call. So you may hear talking in the background, but COVID.
So it's 2020, no worries.
It's 2020. There was no way around that. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now, which hopefully this goes better than it went the last time. How do I get rid of this thing? Oh, perfect. Okay, hopefully you guys can all see it. I'm not sure if you see the side views. Do you guys see that side thing?
Perfect.
You do?
Yep.
Oh, you do see the side
you see,
with
like,
the
the
notes?
next slide. Yep.
Okay.
So it's not fully on presentation mode, I don't think yet.
Okay, is it now presentation mode?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, dual screens, still learning. Okay, so my talk for today is going to be, I'll be looking sometimes this way because that's going to be where the presentation mode is. But my talk is on deconstructing global rhetorics of mutuality and progress surrounding Chinese development in Jamaica. So just a little bit about myself. My dissertation is currently titled The Diasporic Identities in the Age of Rising China. And what I'm looking at are 3 things that I'm hoping to do with my dissertation. 1, to examine how legacies of colonialism as well as complex racialization models within the Black majority Caribbean context affects Chinese expansion within Jamaica. Hold on 1 second. You're a bit loud. Sorry. Within Jamaica in 2018, which is the year preceding Jamaica's adoption of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The second is to trace the development of the Chinese Jamaican community. So I'm looking specifically at development through the lens of the existent Chinese Jamaican community, and tracing their development in order to understand Chinese relations within the region. as well as how colonial hauntings are racially, economically, and politically reconstituted in geopolitical interactions between Jamaica and China. Finally, oh, sorry, my apologies. I'm also trying to widen concepts of diaspora and racialization to attend to the intimacies between Africa and Asia that emerge in the Caribbean and how these transnational identities are shaped by global development processes inherent in the Belt and Road Project. So to just kind of decomplicate that, basically what I'm trying to do is to understand a lot of the work on Chinese development in the Caribbean looks at this macro perspective of economic flows. And while I think that is very interesting, I think that there's a gap, and specifically the gap I believe that is there is on how do these like larger economic flows come to bear in local situations. And so I'm really interested in understanding the local concept of the local context of Chinese development in Jamaica. And in order to do that, I use Chinese communities in Jamaica as a strategic view, as they often serve as mediators between the Jamaican state and the Chinese state. And so my methods were 13 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Jamaica, Canada, and the United States. Mostly my fieldwork was in Kingston, Jamaica. I did over 30, probably closer to 40 something interviews with the Jamaican representatives, Chinese and Chinese Jamaican cultural association leaders, Black Jamaicans, and private construction management. I really wanted to get a broad set of interviews. I also complemented that with some archival research within the Jamaica National Archives and the Statistical Institute, which is where all of their GIS and census information is held, and then discursive analysis of local and international media policies surrounding Chinese economic development initiatives within Jamaica. So that was mostly looking at media representation of Chinese development, both on a local scale and on a global scale. So chapter 5, so the chapter that you guys potentially read, if you didn't, that's totally okay, was my chapter 5, which is, has basically 4 aims. One is to recognize the Caribbean as a strategic area for development analysis. So most of Chinese development analysis is currently occurring in Africa. Some of it is occurring in like Europe. And so, and there's a reason why that is. There's tons and tons of money being pushed into that region, especially the continent of Africa, for research extraction. However, I want to argue that the Caribbean and Latin America, which are more recent additions to Chinese, the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'll talk about shortly, are very strategic areas to look at these ideas because of their colonial history. And specifically, their colonial history has consistently made them a source of analysis, as well as a consistent places where people like anthropologists have been able to kind of track global flows in a really discrete way because of the constructed nature of Caribbean societies, because they're not pre-colonial, right? They were constructed during the colonial region. And so we know that they have historically reflected the ebbs and flows of the countries around them. And so because of that, historically, the Caribbean has been a strategic site of development analysis. And I believe that in considering China's growth, we should consider them as another strategic area. I also want to propose rhetorical and discourse analysis is a productive way to understand development analysis. So again, as I said before, a lot of development analysis is based off of thinking about like economic flows. And while I think those are important, I argue in my paper that there's a very distinct discursive element to the ways in which China operates, mostly because of its competition with countries like the US. And because of the colonial context of some of the regions in which it's it's working in, it wants to mobilize and to think of the Belt and Road Project as something which it can mobilize as opposed to something which it could, which it controls. That's the narrative that they want to produce. And to trace how these rhetorical strategies are operationalized both on the ground and at a global perspective. And then specifically for this talk, I want to start thinking about and identifying ways in which the IID framework can be integrated into my analysis to make it stronger and more coherent. Okay, so I'm going to start off really quickly with an overview of the Belt and Road analysis, the Belt and Road Initiative, sorry. So the Belt and Road Initiative was created or operationalized in about 2013 by the People's Republic of China. And basically what it is this revised idea of the Silk Route that is supposed to run through Central Asia with maritime routes that include Southeast Asia and Africa. So that was the original plan for the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you kind of follow my mouse, you can see that there is like the original Silk Road economic belt, which kind of goes like this. And then the new Belt and Road Initiative includes both roadways and also railroads that are going to connect these countries to provide extra trade. So it will link ostensibly the PRC to 65 other countries that account for collectively 30% of the global GDP, 62% of the world's population, and 75% of known energy reserves. So this is like a huge initiative as far as creating global trade. In 2019, so last year, China decided after about a decade of doing trade in Latin America and the Caribbean to formally invite them into the Belt and Road Initiative. So obviously the Caribbean and Latin America were not a part of the original Silk Route, but it's being expanded to include these areas because of the potential of research extraction and trade in those areas. And so this is becoming this really large initiative if it gets to be completed in the ways in which China imagines, that would basically create a large economic trade route that would connect them with resources around the world without having to deal as much with the US and Western Europe. And so like the UK and stuff. There's another complementary policy that goes along with this, which is the going out policy, which was started in 1999 around the opening up of China. And this economically incentivizes Chinese companies to pursue business engagements in other developing countries. And so because of this, at the same time as we're seeing this Belt and Road Initiative, which is like sponsored by the PRC and PRC banks, especially the China Import-Export Bank, to fund these global projects. At the same time, local Chinese agents are being incentivized to also go to these countries and do trade. And so we're seeing both in China, like both local agents or both individual agents and large agents working as a part of this plan. In the Caribbean and Latin America, China has provided over $141 billion of loans since 2005, and you will see around 2005 a sharp increase. For example, in Jamaica, the loans were about like, I think it was like $30,000 in like 2007 or something like that, and now it's in the billions of dollars of aid. So it's a very sharp increase. Investment includes infrastructure investment for the exportation of national resources, and as well as the creation of beltways and roadways in different countries, one of them being Jamaica. So you can see all the different projects on this map provided by the Inter-American Dialogue, which I do critique in my paper, but it's also super useful as like a giant source of data. But you can see through different countries, there are all these different projects that are basically going to be connecting China to Latin America and the Caribbean. In Jamaica, there have been billions in current and future FDI invested in the region. Specifically, some of the largest projects were the North-South Highway and the potential East-West Highway, which are basically going to the creation of new highways across Jamaica to provide better trade or to provide easier travel across the island. Urban, rural infrastructure, roads. So in addition to the highways, there is also the production of other roadways that connect to the highway. The Jamaica's first overhead bypass, which interestingly they had the plans for since the 80s, but they've never had the money or the equipment to create. The revitalization of the bauxite and sugar industry, bauxite and sugar being two of Jamaica's largest exports, and special economic zones. They were incentivized by 50 years of toll for the highway, over 1,200 acres of land as well. And also Chinese companies get more competitive bids on other potential projects. So there have been several critiques of Chinese development, especially in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Rhetorical strategies for those critiques often rely on this idea of a China model or a Beijing consensus, which identifies China as threatening to Western democracy, destroying land and national resources, providing low paid wages for local workers, the usage of Chinese workers and equipment and materials, which will potentially destroy local economies because they're not using local resources for the construction, and unsustainable payment plans or maintenance plans for the things that they produce. In particular, one entity that has been particularly critical of China's role in the Latin American Caribbean area is the US. And this is really interesting because I incorporate in my chapter that these criticisms actually, for once, go across party lines. So I give an example of both Hillary Clinton and Mike Pence basically saying the same thing, which is that China is potentially threatening to democracy and that Caribbean and Latin American countries should be, or developing countries in general, because in the Mike Pence case, he was talking to countries in Asia, but that they should be critical of Chinese development aid because it is not in their benefit. And in Jamaica, it was really interesting because while in a lot of other regions, it's been kind of like different US officials going to these regions, high profile officials, but different officials. In Jamaica, it was actually President Obama himself who made a trip to Jamaica in 2015 to spend a couple of days on the island. And a lot of reports came back that his goal was really to dissuade the island from ramping up their connections with China. And so in one speech, he says, he's talking to young leaders at the University of the West Indies, and he specifically says kind of like, China is great. We're not really criticizing China because if they're giving you like infrastructure and improving education, we think that's great. And it's really interesting that he uses those words because those are specifically US interests. So US development interests tend to be education, poverty, women's rights, things that do not fall within the scope of China's aid priorities. But if the investments are made solely to mine and extract raw materials that are going to be shipped back to China, then you might want to consider if those are in your long-term interests, right? So we see this, Obama kind of gives the least critical, other agents of the state give more critical reflections on Chinese aid. Obama is kind of like hedges that this might not be something that you want to consider. And while others directly position China as a threat to democracy and the Caribbean and Latin America's decisions as imperative to the continuation of democracy in the region, which happens to be important because it's America's backyard. And so if you know anything about American kind of like policies within the Caribbean and Latin America, we know that America has a lot of intervention, has a history of interventionist policies in protecting the region from foreign interference. And so there have been a lot of rhetorical strategies by the US to kind of dissuade agents from different countries from doing more deals with China at the same time as, ironically, the US is actually pulling out of the region, because a lot of countries like Jamaica are graduating in aid. So basically, by graduating means that they're becoming like middle income countries or upper middle income countries. Specifically, Jamaica is now an upper middle income country, I believe, and so they do not have access to certain forms of U.S. aid that they may actually need. The PRC's development ideologies and development rhetoric is polar opposite to what the U.S. Talks about. So specifically, they understanding the colonial context of a lot of the countries in the global south that they work with, they've instead produced a more, what Padrig and Carmody, who are really great scholars in this area, call a rhizome-like approach, which means that they utilize networks of influence in order to communicate and connect on a local interpersonal level in order to create trust. And a lot of that trust is based on this rhetoric of harmony, partnership, mutuality that is really epitomized by their 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which include mutual respect for each other, and territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference in international affairs. So like basically whatever you do, we don't care. Equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful existence. And so a lot of the rhetorical strategies that come out of that are words like mutuality, South-South exchange, and partnership. One of the things that I love the most about my research is that if I at any point go onto the Chinese embassy in Jamaica's website and look at their previous speeches, I can literally control find any of these terms and I will find them explicitly said in the messaging. So this is an example of then Ambassador Tian Chi, who was a part of, he was at this time giving a speech for the opening of the North-South Highway, and it's renaming for former Prime Minister Siaga, who's this guy right here. And in this speech, we see these explicit words used, so partnership, mutual benefit, friendly cooperation, all of these. The only terms that he doesn't use is like South-South engagement. So there, like if you look across the speeches, and if you look at speeches by other ambassadors in other globally South countries, you will find these words. It's very on message. So I wanted to look at, and I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to look at how these rhetorics, these global rhetorics by these international competitors around this idea of Chinese development strategies as either parasitic or as a potential like savior, how they are deployed on the ground and how they're seen by local actors who are actually engaging in or being affected by these development strategies. And what I noticed was something interesting. What I noticed, so in my chapter, I chose 3 case studies: the demolition of the Constant Spring Market, the potential Chinese purchase of the Gold Island Transshipment Hub, and the Chinese, engagements on Chinese construction sites. So what I noticed is that on each of these sites, that local actors, specifically local low-income Jamaicans, actually in a lot of their language utilize similar rhetorical strategies, but instead of using them to position China as, sometimes they do literally say China as a colonizer, but mostly it is to position themselves as the focus. You'll notice that in a lot of these rhetorical strategies, the China or the US are really the focus of the analysis, particularly their potential or their morality. But instead, these local actors position themselves at the center as well as their histories and use these kind of like human rights rhetorics in order to claim better representation in these engagements. So for example, at the Constant Spring Market, you can see a picture below of like women in probably like the 19th century going to the Constant Spring Market. I don't think it's that old, but it's a pretty old market. I couldn't find an actual date, but it's located in the upper class area of Manor Park. And it is a historic market that was demolished in order to create a road widening project. And so something I noticed in this site is that the women vendors, what they did was to make claims that while the upper class and the government was making claims that this needed to be done in order to create progress, the women centered themselves in the rhetoric in order to say, how can they deal with us without compassion? That while we understand that progress needs to occur, that they should be compassionate to our positionality, and that we should be considered as a part of this progress. This progress cannot occur around Jamaicans. So something that's really interesting, oops, sorry. So on the top of the screen is the market, the Constant Spring Market, and some of the women or some people demonstrating inside the market. And you kind of see that there's kind of like some hills in the background on this side. Well, if you actually look on the literal opposite of this street, opposite side of the street, is Manor Park Plaza, which is this plaza down here, which you can see looks very fancy and in truth is very fancy. They have wine bars, nail salons, a Payless, a Popeyes, 2 supermarkets. Like it's a very fancy plaza. And no, nothing was demolished out of that plaza in order to widen the road for quote unquote progress. And so we see through those kind of choices that progress is strategically not linked to the lives and the positionality of working class people. Progress is for the elite. And so there are actually tons of elite companies on that street, and most of them did not experience a lot of harm. However, smaller plazas that hosted like shoddy looking bars or had lots of vendors or street market sellers, those were the areas that were demolished in order to create this kind of quote unquote progress. So one rhetorical strategy that locals use is to take these concepts of progress and to put themselves at the center of what progress should be considered. In the Goat Island Transshipment Hub, and this is way too long of a quote for me to say, that was a potential plan by the Chinese government to purchase 2 small islands off the coast of Jamaica for a transshipment hub. Remember that Jamaica is pretty close to Cuba, right south of Florida. And so it is a very strategic area if you would want to create a transshipment hub that could potentially connect to ports in Africa or elsewhere. And so a lot of the vendors and market people and fishermen who were working in Goat Island actually used environmental rhetoric to center themselves. So they talked about this in this quote, the woman talks about, and this is in patois, so if you read it and you're not understanding, that's completely fine. She talks about how we who live in Goat Island or near the Goat Island in Old Harbor Bay depend on the fishermen, and the fishermen depend on a fish sanctuary that's created by the Goat Islands. And so the Goat Islands are to be protected as we are also, our livelihoods are to be protected. At the end, she kind of talks about her children. So she says, from this generation, from Pygmies, which is children, till now, if Goat Island is taken away from us, our children won't know about Goat Island because the Chinese take it over. So this kind of idea that this is a national, and it ends up becoming a national, a nationally protected site. And she makes the claim that it should be a naturally protected site, but also that they are a part of the nationality of Jamaica and should also be protected. So this kind of environmental rhetoric to center themselves. And then finally, I don't know why this is the picture, that's an accident, but the construction sites. So there were conflicts on The third place I kind of analyzed in my paper was Chinese construction sites. And this was a really rich area where, which I would recommend that you read, where Jamaican workers on black workers on Chinese construction sites made a lot of claims about pay, facilities, and representation. But in particular, it was something that was interesting to me is that they often hedged these critiques in terms of their human rights and their labor rights. And so they would talk about previous projects they had been on in other countries or previous work that they had done on other sites, and that they were due commensurate pay and commensurate facilities as part of their human rights. They talked a lot about representation. There are actually not a lot of Black management in these sites, and that causes a lot of issues. And so they said things like, we don't have anybody to stand up for us. They can do what they want. They don't care. We don't have any rights. And we're being treated as slave labor, kind of invoking Jamaica's colonial past in order to center their current experiences. So some themes that I see happening in this paper that is developing is that on a global scale and an international scale, that we see specifically that the US and China utilize language and discourse in order to situate each other either as a threat to Caribbean agency or themselves as a potential partner or savior to this region. And those are part of the ways in which these discursive wars, so we talk about these economic wars that are happening, but they're discursive wars that are undergirding these economic flows. And so these are the ways in which they situate themselves. And we noticed that in my research, I'm seeing that Jamaicans, low income, working class Jamaicans are kind of hip to these discursive engagements that are being waged on their behalf, and that they reoperationalize these themes and these kinds of cosmopolitan rhetorics around human rights and around progressiveness that these countries are supposed to be offering in order to center their own agency, experiences, and oppression and advocate for their own goals. In doing that, something that it recognizes is a gap, which is what is the role of the Jamaican state in these engagements, because they're often very silent or very missing in this rhetoric. And they are to be the intermediaries between the Chinese state and the needs of their people. Something I talk about in the paper, but I don't have quite enough time to talk about here, is also how by making the choice to use human rights in order to talk about themselves, unfortunately, one thing that happens on both the global and the local scale is that the rights of Chinese migrant workers are obscured by both rhetorics, meaning that their own lived experiences, their own protections, and their own basically their own experiences are obscured by these rhetorics of progress, because they are seen to be the bodies constructing progress. Their own experiences are never considered, and they live in a lot of fear and a lot of precarity because of that. And so that is also the ways in which language can obfuscate and silence the positionality of others. So the next stage of this project, something that I want to work on, is operationalizing the IAD in order to help me better organize this chapter. And I think that the IAD framework will be very useful in terms of organization and specifically unpacking the complex actors that are occurring within these nested action arenas, to reflect, in order to help me both reflect local and global change at the same time, and in order to kind of be able to talk about how they're interacting with each other, and also to help me better recognize where the gaps in either communication or the gaps in representation are occurring. So my current kind of hypothesis is the Jamaican government, but there might be additional ways in which language or cultural norms are creating problems that even the government could not respond to. I also want to use it to, I think it could help me to recognize, in doing so, think it can help me recognize the different rules that are coming to bear in these local conflicts, specifically language, cultural norms of exchange, and perceptions of equal payoff. And I think the last one is really a big one in what the state might think is payoff in these exchanges might not be what local citizens are considering as equitable payoff. And those might be causing some conflicts as well. So those are my thoughts. That's my presentation. I would love to hear your feedback. Any questions or comments or productive changes would be well appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Virtual round of applause that I'm sure everybody is joining me in right now. Thank you. And thanks for sticking with. I know it can be annoying when there's stuff going on in the background, but I thought you handled it very, very well. And I know that there's a lot of great comments and suggestions coming. It looks like Lulu would like to kick us off. So feel free to use and Renzo next the raise hand feature there. And then we'll also be following along the chat box. Though let me just ask, because I know, let me see if actually, I'm not sure if Edu, I think you might still be on the line and I know you have to take off. Is there any point that you wanted to make first before you had to do that? And sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jordan. This was a really, really nice presentation. Not specific, I mean, I'll just share a very broad comment. I've been talking to Jordan occasionally about this. I love this project. A comment on in terms of the IAD. I think that the project as a whole, has, or I think there's an application of the IAD for the project as a whole to outline these various adjacent, action situations influence each other in this process at a broad scope. And what I was thinking as she was talking is that, that is an interesting frame for the project as a whole because of the nature of the problem. Mm-hmm. And then different chapters can help to unpack different components of that relationship. And what I see in this particular chapter is that, it's a chapter focusing on the role of framings and narratives about the development projects and the different frames and narratives that she finds in all those different sites. So that's my quick thought here. And I think that also is an interesting application of the idea, to bring issues of framing and narratives to explore the role that they play in the outcomes that are, of development in the sites. So very brief comment.
Oh no, that was great. And sorry for not much heads up, Edu. That was well done, Jordan. Any response? I'm sure you completely disagree, right?
Yes, completely. He was absolutely wrong. No, I'm kidding. But no, I think that really is what I'm aiming to do, is to kind of attempt to, think through and provide novel ways of looking at these problems that other people have looked at through lenses that I don't necessarily see as capacious enough to understand the complete issues that are occurring. And so I agree that I believe the IAD framework, both in this chapter as well as other chapters that reflect on different portions of these engagements, are really helpful to just thinking about Chinese development as we are all kind of awestruck and watching it go from multiple levels and perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. Thanks, Edu. Yeah, it looks like we have a growing queue, so I want to make sure we get to everybody. So unless you had anything else, we'll move to Lulu next and then Renzo.
Cool. Can you hear me?
We sure can, Lulu. I love your picture, by the way.
Thank you. I'm monkey. Jordan, thank you very much for your presentation. As a Chinese, I definitely don't know enough what our government is doing in your country, and I've found your presentation is very interesting and a lot of details. But I don't think I have no co-condition enough to offer comments, but I just share one of my thoughts. So in your presentation, I noticed the two major incentives for Chinese government to invest in Jamaica. First one is political, geopolitical. The second one is economics. So my question is, what is the Chinese government doing? Infrastructure, education is what they have been doing domestically. They think that's good policy for economic development. The question is, what do they get out of the Jamaica? Do you have numbers? Say they come there, invest this much of money, and they get out of this value of resources? So the reason I ask this is I was wondering, because those are two incentives, if you can evaluate or give a monetary value to the economic incentives, maybe when you analyze a specific behavior or outcome, you can know which incentives plays a bigger role. If the Chinese government didn't get enough money, which I heard a lot, they make bad investment, they never get money enough back. So then maybe the primary incentives is political instead of economic. So that's, but if they got a lot of resources, and then maybe you can argue the political incentives is as important as economic. I hope that's helpful. That's it.
No, I think that's a really good point. And Jamaica is definitely part of the areas where they're definitely not getting as much money as they're putting back in. In particular, a lot of the economic money, a lot of the money that's been put into specifically developing Jamaica's natural resource extraction in bauxite and in sugar. A lot of those companies are not functioning well, and they're not making a lot of money. They're making enough bauxite, and they're not producing a lot. They're making enough bauxite is what eventually makes aluminum, to provide some to China. So more than what they're able to produce themselves, but it's definitely not on scale to the how much money they're putting in. And so a lot of people have been questioning what then is the point of China putting in all this money into Jamaica. And there is a potential option that kind of goes between the political and the economic, which is the geographic component. Specifically where Jamaica is located makes it a very strategic point between a lot of Latin American countries that may have better resources that they can extract in order to ship them elsewhere. And that's specifically why China was looking to use Jamaica as the Go Islands as a transshipment hub. And so even though that has not worked, I think that they see enough benefit in the potential of the region to continue work there in order to potentially help them in future engagements that they're doing in other countries. One country that, so I think there's definitely like a long-term scope to the Belt and Road project, especially in countries like Venezuela, where they've been putting a lot of money and not getting as much money back, or the Venezuela owes them a lot of money. There's definitely seems to be this long-term goal that I don't know necessarily that we're all like super hip to, like we don't completely understand. But there is a long-term plan that even though there are deficits in this region, that it seems to be still useful enough to continue there. That isn't necessarily political in the ways in which we typically think of, you know, giving money in order to start a coup or something like that.
Thanks so much. No, great question, Lulu, and the response there, Jordan. And it looks like Renzo is next. Then we'll go to Brian and Jamie.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Jordan. I think this is a really interesting paper. I really like all the narratives you've been able to collect. It's definitely a lot of work that you have to do to be able to gather, collect, do the interviews, collect the data, analyze the documents. So this qualitative approach is excellent and much needed for these kinds of projects. So congratulations for that. I had a question. I don't know if you have this on other chapters, but I think you mentioned this at the end of your presentation. I was wondering, what's the role of the Jamaican government in all this, and what's the perception of people thinking about the legacies of colonialism and power and all this that you discussed throughout the participation of the Chinese companies and the Chinese government. I didn't see much on what is the role in mediating this of the Jamaican government and how much local elites and the power they have comes into play into leading to these types of interaction of whether there is mutuality or whether there's progress or what the perception of progress prevails. So just wondering what you could say about the role of the Jamaican government, thinking about legacies of colonialism in the country and these interactions of these investors. And I was also really curious about your last section on the images of Chinese bodies. So that was something that you don't usually look into. So the country investing, a government or private companies from another country investing in a different country, bringing their own people, and how these people have different treatment, some sort of secondary or marginalized labor, or maybe slave labor in a way, based on the quotes you provide. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about it, because it's sort of interesting, not only on the part of the treatment by the companies that reflect probably some certain policies, labor policies in China, but also about the Jamaican government, because they are employees in the country, so they have to receive some sort of protection under Jamaican labor law, I guess, or human rights, and how they are employed in the country. So I was wondering what else within this framework of power and legacies of colonialism you could say about those two things that I was just saying. But thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I did want to say, I said this at the beginning of the presentation, but I just saw somebody's comment. I am so sorry about the competing noises here. We are
Not your
sharing
fault.
space, and my mom works in finance. So, but yeah, so something, so to answer the first question about the role of the Jamaican government, that was something that's definitely interesting to me, and it is a audible gap. So I did do work with, well, I'll say it in two parts. The first part is that another chapter is going to focus more on the work of mediators, specifically the Jamaican government and Chinese cultural associations in these engagements. So that is another chapter. So it's not so much here, but an audible, something that I noticed in looking at my interviews is that there's definitely a perception that the Jamaican government is not functioning as a good mediator, in that there is a lot of the interlocutors that I spoke with felt like the government was looking out more for the goals of the upper class, or the goals of they felt that the government was looking for the goals of progress, and that the goals of progress were really couched in class. And so things like the positioning of the constant spring market versus the Manor Park Plaza is one example of that. But other examples include the fact that Jamaican civil service workers were often sent to China to receive training. And so tons of money was going into the constabulary force, into civic agencies, in order to kind of send them to China or give them funding for Chinese interests, or the interests of Chinese nationals. And so locals were seeing that and not feeling like they were being incentivized. So there's definitely a silence, more than a discussion of the Jamaican government, there's an audible silence. I noticed in my data. And so that's something that I want to look into further. As far as the positionality of Chinese bodies, that is also something that I saw that was very interesting, because I did quite a lot of interviews with people who were coming to work on these sites, or coming to work on like the companies that were setting up 5G in Jamaica and stuff. And they talked a lot about their own feelings of precarity and also their feelings of fear. And I noticed that that was not something that was talked about. And I am really curious in if those are a part of a connected narrative, that the feelings of precarity and oppression that Jamaicans are feeling, local Jamaicans, and lack of representation, is a similar thing to what Chinese workers are feeling, and if that is a repercussion of the ways in which these kinds of globalized trades and developments are thought of on the international scale, and how they do not necessarily think about the positionality of locals, and the kind of gap between the local and the international scale. So that's kind of how I'm starting to think about those, but I still have some way to go. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but I hope it does.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to keep rolling just in the interest of time. So Brian, and then we'll do Jamie, and then hopefully Du will have a chance to get to your comment and question as well.
Okay, good. A bunch of interesting issues in terms of Chinese investment and how it's being experienced, and what kind of agency there is for Caribbean people, or Jamaicans in particular. So in relation to that and your comment about IAD, I'm going to point out you might want to look at Vincent Ostrom's paper on crypto imperialism, and because IAD is not just a neutral technical framework. It was very much came out of Vincent and Lynn's quest of what's the potential for self-governance as the underlying and goal. And that paper is about what may be possible when you have this kind of international geopolitical connotation going on in an earlier era. And now you're looking at those questions now. The question I more have is, to what extent, again, in terms of local perceptions and how people frame them, their imaginaries, are there some like broader visions that people are engaged with? Are they aspiring for something more than just that bourgeois life or international standard human rights? And since it's Jamaica, and I don't know much else about it, I will go ahead and ask. Reggae had a politics, and there was a philosophy in Rastafarianism. Are there any broader ideas, visions, imaginaries that seem to come out or be reference for the people you're listening to and talking with? Thank you.
I think that's like such a good point, because I definitely think that Jamaican spirit, if you want to call it that, but that I talk about it more in my work as kind of like a post-colonial vision of rights, and that is an integral part of Jamaica's history. Is a very especially its post-independence history, is considering themselves as a part of the African diaspora, and therefore endued with a certain amount of rights and legibility. And I think that is the understanding that is that is coming through in these rhetorics. And so I believe that if I trace that, especially through the works of people who specifically look at those kinds of ideals in things like reggae music, but as well as in Jamaican politics, which is very, very, very interesting, that you would see kind of this longing for a non-oppressive kind of like this kind of Black utopia, I think, is the idea that kind of undergirds a lot of these imaginaries, and the ideas of Black bodies as like sacred and protected, and that there is that they should be able to live without the interference of these states. So I think that there is an idea of that is undergirding these in these rhetorics. And that is tied into Jamaica's history. And also Jamaica has a very complex history with China and with Chinese people. And those are also things that are reflected in this rhetoric as well. And so I think that definitely those are both things that are there, and both things that I hope to better be able to talk about in future projects.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. And thank you, Brian, for copying those. We'll make sure you get a copy of the chat just for future reference, Jordan. Awesome. Okay. And it looks like Jamie is next, and then we can turn to your comment before we have to conclude here probably.
Great, Lynn or Jordan, I really like your work. I've always been fascinated by it. And I know you talked about like similar things that you and I end up talking about, which are culture, right? And even language and how people use those things. And so I've been thinking a lot about language and how in the Ostroms, actually, Vincent Ostrom talks about language in this book. So I'll put it in the chat for you. So it's easy because when we think about the Ostrom's theory, it's easy to get caught up with either like the code words, right? Like commons, IAD, SES frameworks. But those are words that mean a lot of things. They're symbols for a lot of things. And I know you know this. But we forget that there's this whole vast array of scholarship when we talk about the Ostroms as well, that just really supplements everything that's captured in those words. And so that's why I really encourage you to look at Vincent's work on language. But also, the Ostroms themselves talk about how a word can be like a symbol for something. And so that's what I'm really kind of seeing in this rhetoric that you're talking about, where you talk about how the Jamaican lower class people were taking rhetoric. I forget who originated the rhetoric, but they were changing it for their own context, and they were like changing it to mean what they wanted it to mean. And yeah, we see that happen with symbols. Things that are symbols are easy to change like that. Francesca Viano talked about that last week during the Tocqueville lecture, and how the Statue of Liberty, for instance, it meant one thing in the elite classes, that and its meaning was changed by the immigrants. So it's weird. I know it's a weird connection, but I see the same kinds of changes happening in both situations. So I don't know. Just my response.
No, those are great connections. No, thank you so much.
That is actually really, really helpful. And I definitely plan to look at that book once you post it in the chat.
Yeah. And thank you, Brian, for posting that other one. And I was going to mention that as well, Jordan, kind of this idea of polycentricity applied to international relations is also kind of a useful tool that you could use to think about what's going on here, right? And in some ways there's this G2 bipolar competition, but it's also not even multipolar. It's really kind of a polycentric competition, and how the Belt and Road is kind of fitting into that, what the US response has been, and those of other kind of regional groupings, around Brazil, I'm thinking, and then more broadly, that could also be kind of telling. There's not an easy framework, to apply there, but, for example, Mike McGinnis's great, colloquium talk and his collaborators a couple months ago, that's a great, resource for a lot of related, scholarship if you're interested in going down that road even further. And then did you want to expand on your comment at all there?
Yes, I think just a small issue that I think it is very interesting topic, but I think that it is a mixing between here, the Chinese workers. Because I think it's the situation happen in other countries in Asia, maybe in Latin America and other. I think the good bit, with the position of the Chinese worker, I think it should be very interesting. They should be very vulnerable, because if they face the hostile from the local workers and local people, and I think the company brought them there and Chinese government represent for them. So what do you think about that, Jordan?
No, that's definitely, so it wasn't something I got to get into the talk, but it's something that there's a small section in the chapter that's that I plan to expand on. But basically they are very vulnerable in a lot of ways, because there's complexity and diversity even within the ranks of Chinese migrant workers. So there are like the lower income workers who are coming to maybe make enough money to buy a house in China. And then there are the managers who are actually 20-something-year-olds who this is like their first gig out of school. And so there's different levels of precarity and marginality that both of those agents experience. And because Jamaica is listed as one of the countries with the top murders per capita in the world, there are also a lot of restrictions that these people experience, and a lot of rhetoric that they hear about danger, that their bodies are dangerous, that they will experience danger if they ever leave the sites. And Jamaica has a very, unfortunately, xenophobic history that is reflected in a lot of countries. That they also hear in the paper, I describe a manager who talks about wanting to make friends with Chinese Jamaicans, but being afraid to do so because he's afraid if he goes outside of his camp that he'll be attacked. And he shares stories that he heard on WeChat of other people who had been attacked or who had been murdered in order to get money from them. And there's a lot of rhetoric in Jamaica that Chinese, so at the same time as there's Chinese migrant workers on the sites, there are independent Chinese folks who create shops and stuff. And those people are known for not banking in Jamaican banks and for carrying around large quantities of money. And so they are attacked often. And so men on the sites think that they will also be attacked for their money, even because they look the same. And so they're definitely very precarious. And that precarity is not reflected in the rhetoric of any state, not the Chinese state, not the American state, not Jamaicans. That they are kind of invisible, even though they are the hands and feet of the actual labor that's being operationalized. And so they end up being very scared and also being very overworked. So they also have the same conditions that the Black Jamaican workers experience as well. And so I think that that's definitely a very interesting part of the work that needs to be further looked at, not just by me, but also by others. And there are some people that are doing it in other spheres, but it's definitely mostly overlooked because we're looking so much at the outcome that we're not necessarily always looking at the bodies that produce it. So I agree.
Fantastic. Well, hey, one more round of applause, because thank you so much, Jordan. Echoing Jamie's chat there, it's just fascinating. You can take this in so many directions. So very well done. We look forward to following it with great interest. And sorry for a couple minutes after 1 o'clock, guys. Thanks for sticking with. Hope to see many of you either physically, potentially, or virtually tomorrow at Lynn's statue unveiling. It's a great week. Thanks again, Jordan, and be safe. And see you guys all very soon. Thanks again.